Signore e signori, buonasera, benvenuti alla Casa Italiana Zerilli-Marimò della New York University. Welcome to the seminar organized by the Primo Levi Center, the NYU Department of History, and us here at Casa Italiana. It's always a great pleasure to work with our friends at the Primo Levi Center, especially now that they're our neighbors here at SF Vanni, provisionally, but we hope for a long time. As you know, the theme of this evening is the Jewish race, law, and identity in fascist Italy. And the discussion is based on the publication of a recent book by Michael Livingston, The Fascists and the Jews of Italy, Mussolini's Race Laws, 1938-1943. Some of you probably think, we've already talked about this at great length, and we did. In several occasions we had the opportunity to discuss with prominent scholars, both from Italy, the US, and other parts of the world about this theme. But there seem to be still so many misconceptions, commonplaces, and ignorance altogether about this topic, both here and in Italy, that it's probably a very good thing that such a book came out, so comprehensive, and to have an opportunity to discuss this book with prominent scholars that are here tonight. I have the pleasure to greet my colleagues Natalia Endrimi and Alessandro Cassin, Director and Deputy Director of the Centro Primo Levi, and also to introduce the moderator of the evening, Ruth Ben-Ghiat, my colleague and friend here in the Department of Italian Studies. Ruth was the chair of the department and really contributed to building it basically from scratch when she was chair. She's also a member of the Department of History here at New York University. Her research interests concentrate on the culture of fascism and the surrounding areas. Her most recent book that we presented here a couple of weeks ago, Empire Cinema, is a groundbreaking work that I suggest all of you read about the cinema that was produced in Italy at the time of the empire. Ruth did some incredible research on films that nobody living but her has seen, and discovering incredible connections between the cinema of imperial Italy and British, French cinema, the Orientalist tradition, and many other things. This is just the last piece in the an incredible scholarship that Ruth Ben-Ghiat has built. She's right now working on war prisoners, Italian war prisoners in different parts of the Second World War theater. She's a great mentor and a wonderful colleague, and it's my great pleasure to introduce you to her tonight. Please welcome Ruth Ben-Ghiat.
Thank you, Stefano. Oh, excuse me. Thank you very much for that generous introduction. It's always so glad we worked together for so long. And really happy to be here tonight to have this panel on this groundbreaking book. And I will introduce all of the panelists. And what the format will be is each one will come up, and Ariela Gross and David Kertzer will speak about the book, and then the author, Michael Livingston, will come up and respond. And then they will all take their seats here, and we will have some questions and open it up to questions from you. So our first speaker, Ariela Gross, is the John B. and Alice R. Sharp Professor of Law and History at the University of Southern California. Her book, What Blood Won't Tell, A History of Race on Trial in America, published in 2010 by Harvard, examines the legal history of racial identity, showing how the relationships of race have affected claims of citizenship over the last 150 years. The book reminds us that the imaginary connection between racial identity and fitness for citizenship remains potent today and continues to impede racial justice and equality. And our second speaker, David Kertzer, has been the Dupuy University Professor of Social Science. That's what he is at Brown University. He's also professor of anthropology and Italian studies. He's published many books, a specialist on contemporary Italy, modern Italy, and of course church-state relationships and Italian communism. His latest book, The Pope and Mussolini, The Secret History of Pius XI and the Rise of Fascism in Europe, won the Pulitzer Prize recently for biography and autobiography. Is that the correct category? And I was saying to David, I was so thrilled, first of all, for him. He's a wonderful scholar I've known for years. And I feel like it must be one of the only times that a book on Italy has attracted the attention of the Pulitzer. So I was thrilled as an Italianist as well as a friend and colleague. And our author, Michael Livingston, is professor of law at Rutgers School of Law in Camden. Professor Livingston has published extensively on tax law, comparative law, and other subjects, including articles in the Yale Law Journal, Cornell Law Review, and many others. And he's taught at Tel Aviv University, Cornell, and other places, and lectured in Israel and Italy and the United States. And he offers a course on law and the Holocaust, which has been taught in 3 different countries and is one of the few of its kind in American law schools. And his book is one of the few of its kind. And I'll just say to start off that for me, it's an example of how useful and fruitful it is to have someone from a different discipline in a different area come and train their gaze and their scholarship on a subject that in some ways we think we know. So it's really, I see it as a really important and groundbreaking book, but I will leave it to others to speak. So Ariela?
Ruth,
Yes.
sorry, it was my mix-up, but I think we reason like ladies first, but then maybe it would be more logical to have David first.
Okay. David?
Well, thank you. It's nice to be back at NYU and to participate in another event that's co-sponsored by the Primo Levi Center and the Italian Studies program department here at NYU. I thought just say a word about the racial laws. I imagine virtually everybody here is quite familiar with the racial laws. But the racial laws were introduced in Italy in 1938, primarily aimed at the Jews of Italy, although also at Africans. There weren't all that many Africans in Italy, although, of course, there were the colonies. For the Jews, the racial laws would mean over the course of a few months in the fall of 1938, all Jewish children thrown out of schools, all Jewish teachers and professors fired, all Jewish civil servants fired, all Jewish members of the military fired, bank employees, insurance company employees, civil servants, all out of work, and Jewish professionals limited to practicing with only Jewish clients. So it was a dramatic event, dramatic trauma, obviously for the Jewish community, but more generally in modern Italian history. Now, the racial laws, as was mentioned, have gotten a lot of scholarly attention. They're also the subject of quite a lot of scholarly and more general controversy. This controversy that's been very evident recently, Italy just celebrated, for example, last week, 2 events, within the last week, the April 25th, the anniversary of the liberation from the Nazi fascist regime in Italy, but also the 70th anniversary on the 28th of the execution of Benito Mussolini. So this is, those of you who follow the Italian press have been reading a lot of kind of retrospectives about the history, including the impact of the racial laws. Now, as was mentioned, the book that we're focusing on today, Michael Livingston's The Fascists and the Jews of Italy, seeks to shed light on these larger debates by coming at it from a rather different perspective, the perspective of a legal scholar and someone who hasn't previously been a specialist in European legal history either. One thing I would say about this work is that Michael amply cites the relevant larger historical literature. So although this is has not been his area of academic specialization, clearly he's immersed himself in the relevant literature and then proceeded to do a study based on original primary legal sources that shed new light on this history. Now, perhaps the main myth of Italian history that Michael takes aim at, a myth that's been the target of other recent works as well, is the myth many of you are familiar with here of Italiani brava gente, the Italians, the good Italian, contrasting the kind of amiable live and let live Italian with those nasty Germans and other uptight nationalities who were kind of cutthroat ideologues. The Italians never really believed in fascism and so forth. And in this view, the Italian anti-Semitic campaign was not deeply rooted in the culture. Most people weren't enthusiastic about it. It was kind of came out of the blue from nowhere. Presumably Mussolini wanted to please Hitler and took the rest of the Italian population by surprise. And at best, they went along with this all somehow grudgingly. Of course, the picture that Michael presents us with is a very different one. One other element that's the subject of his book has to do with the Italian bureaucracy. So one of the kind of exculpatory factors that are sometimes used for suggesting that Italian racial laws weren't anything like the Nuremberg laws in Germany or similar laws elsewhere in Europe is that even if they wanted to impose these draconian laws in Italy, the Italian legal and other bureaucracy was so malfunctioning that it actually didn't affect people the way it theoretically should have if you just read the letter of the law. One of the things I think is very useful of Livingston's book is he shows just how fallacious that notion is, that these laws in fact were enforced and were enforced ever more rigorously. Now, Michael uses the central archives of the Italian government, the De Morazza archives in part. They were charged with overseeing the racial laws, and this is how he shows that they were, in fact, enforced. Now, one of the interesting questions is, was there ideological zeal behind the enforcement of these laws? And the conclusion he reaches is, well, no, it wasn't that they seemed to be so deeply rooted ideologically in the judiciary, but this didn't seem to affect things. There was a certain bureaucratic logic. These are the laws. Our job is to enforce them, and they had no apparent moral qualms about doing so. The justices, members of the judiciary who actually protested in any way were diminishingly few. And not only that, the judges tended to decide close cases against Jews and tended to extend the law beyond the letter of the anti-Semitic laws, interpreting the spirit of the laws as being important. The spirit of laws being to persecute the Jews, and therefore, even if the law didn't specifically call for certain negative treatment of Jews, the justices often imposed it anyway in deciding close cases based on this is the intent of the law. Curiously, the one area where judges showed some hesitation in enforcing the racial laws was, according to Michael Livingston, where the law conflicted with other existing law. And so I think one of his main examples here is on pension laws, that it turns out the racial laws didn't say anything about civil servants losing their pensions. And so when I guess someone in the bureaucracy tried not to give pensions to Jews who had been kicked out of their civil service jobs, judges in some cases ruled in favor of the Jews because to rule against them would to go against the pension law. He points out, not surprisingly, that wealthier Jews had more resources for trying to get around the impact of the laws. I was particularly interested in the book, and I thought it was particularly revealing a case involving a grandfather trying to transmit property he was no longer able to hold on to. His son had married a non-Jewish woman and was pregnant. So he was trying to pass his property on to his grandchild. And the court ruled that he could do so, but only if the grandchild was baptized within 10 days of birth. Now, this brings up a whole another issue, which I'll turn to perhaps in a minute, namely the role of the Catholic Church and Christianity in the persecution of the Jews in Italy. But this is a case that presumably would not have happened in Nazi Germany. Well, I will say a word, since it's a bit of a pet topic of mine, I guess. So, what role did the church play in all this? Certainly, if you read, for example, La Difesa della Razza, the main anti-Semitic popular population put out by the government to drum up popular support for the war, it's filled with justification for the racial laws and the racial campaign, the anti-Semitic campaign, from Christianity. From ritual murder charges to various saints and their anti-Semitic words in previous centuries, and to relatively recent publications of the church, including Civiltà Cattolica, the semi-official Vatican Jesuit journal. As Livingston writes in his book, here I'm quoting from him, many Italians, including some in the government, viewed the racial laws as an effective reimposition of traditional religious anti-Semitism rather than a radical new breakthrough. And of course, if you look at Rome, as late as 1870, just before its conquest by the Italian armies, the Jews had a set of restrictions more draconian than those imposed in 1938 by the racial laws, and included many of the very same tenets. In fact, there's virtually no tenet of the 1938 racial laws that weren't part of the laws imposed by the church, as long as they had temporal power over the Jews in their part of Italy, in Papal States and in Rome. One thing I found interesting, Livingston, in this context, refers to, he recites Guido Fubini, who referred to the racial laws as the culmination of a process begun with the Lateran Accords, 1929, rather than, quote, out of nowhere. As I mentioned before, a lot of the discussion of the racial laws is, there was no precedent. Of course, Nazi Germany, no surprise, the Nazis from day one were anti-Semitism. The demonization of the Jews was the basic tenet of Nazism, but not so fascism. Wasn't Margherita Sarfatti Jewish after all? But I think placing this, the imposition of the racial laws in the context of the Lateran Accords, which is rarely done, is actually something worth pondering. Certainly, it's curious, since I mentioned Margherita Sarfatti, I'm sure everyone knows, was a long-time mistress, but not just mistress of Mussolini, but perhaps his main political counselor in crucial early years. Margherita Sarfatti saw the writing on the wall as the Lateran Accords were being finalized in 1928 and was baptized, and subsequently had her two surviving children baptized. Now, the striking lack of empathy that we see portrayed in Livingston's book of Catholic Italians for their Jewish neighbors is also appallingly evident in the immediate post-war period. Other works, for example, have documented how when the Jewish professors lost their jobs and others were able to take them, when the Jews returned after the war, the people who had taken their positions were not willing to give them up. And there are many other examples of this sort of thing. More generally, Livingston in his book attributes the failure of the Italian courts to grant restitution to Jews to the myth of the resistance. And this, too, I think is a very insightful statement. The notion, that is, that all the Italians, or virtually all the Italians, were innocent victims of fascism. None of us were fascists. And therefore, the Jews had no special claim to any kind of restitution. The fact that the courts in the post-war period were populated by very largely the same people who had been enforcing the racial laws just a few years earlier meant that the Jews in Italy were not given much of a hearing after the war. And here, I just wanted to insert, before I conclude, couple of remarks about a debate some of you may be, or a controversy some of you may be following in the Italian press involving Gaetano Azzariti, who I think is absolutely, I won't say typical, but prototypical of the problems of the courts, fascism, the racial laws, and Italy today, and Italy's inability to come to terms with its own past. Who's Gaetano Azzariti? Well, if you go to the Constitutional Court in Italy, which, as you know, is the High Court, they're often called their Supreme Court, in the atrium, there is a bust of a few great heroic figures of Italian jurisprudence, one of whom is Gaetano Azzariti, who from 1957 till his death in the early 60s was president of the Constitutional Court, the Supreme Court of Italy. This is the same man, Gaetano Azzariti, who was one of the early signatures of the Manifesto of Racial Scientists, and who, in fact, because of his great credentials as an anti-Semitic fascist, was made president of the racial tribunal that was set up following the imposition of the racial laws to enforce the racial laws. So from 1939 to the fall of Mussolini in 1943, he was the president of the Tribunal of Race, and he was also instrumental in translating the larger new racial anti-Semitic policy into specific legal norms. Immediately on Mussolini's downfall, Azzariti was chosen by Badoglio to be Minister of Justice, which only lasted a few months because of what happened in that period. But then immediately at the end of the war, he becomes, like many others, he became close to the communists and was a kind of right-hand man of Togliatti, who helped further his career to the point where he became president of the Italian Supreme Court. There are various streets named for Azzariti in Italy. If I had more time, I'd go into this case more, but those of you interested, I'd suggest you know, through Google and so on, get into this. But this is so closely related to Livingston's book in illustrating this, the point he makes, his major thesis, that the anti-Semitic racial laws became accepted and implemented by the judiciary in Italy without virtually a whimper of protest, became just a matter of normal jurisprudence. After the war, there was no reckoning with this history, unlike in Germany and some other countries, and that, in fact, the inability to come to terms is not just a historical reckoning, but actually had practical consequences for Jews who were unable to, after the war, get the restitution that they deserve. So I'd compliment Livingston on the book and look forward to our discussion.
Well, thank you. Thank you to Ruth for the introduction, and to Natalia and to the seminar for having me here, for giving me the opportunity to read this terrific book and think about this topic. As Ruth indicated, I work on the history of race and law in the Americas, so I'm not an expert on Italy or fascism, the Holocaust. So this was a really provocative set of issues for me to think about. And I also have a very personal connection to the topic, as my grandfather, Renzo Toaf, lost his job as a professor of medicine under the racial laws in Italy, where moved to Palestine, where my mother was born, and later met my American father. So in a sense, I owe my existence to these terrible laws. But I very much enjoyed Michael Livingston's book, and it's a chapter of history that needed to be told, both as an aspect of Jewish history, of Italian history, and then my own specialty of legal history. And it really raises some very interesting, more general questions about race and law, more than I can address here, but I'm going to concentrate on just two aspects. And one is, first, the relationship between the Italian racial laws and others, particularly the laws of race in the United States, which is my first area of expertise, to which they bear some resemblances. And then second, more general comparative themes about race and law. So first, they're both, if we think about a relationship between what was going on in the US and in Europe in the 20th century, there are both analogies and influences, or questions of analogy or influence. And the analogy itself has a history, the analogy between Jim Crow in America and Nazi and fascist racial law in Europe. That analogy gained currency as used by the opponents of Jim Crow, especially in the African American press during the 1930s and the 1940s, to call attention to American hypocrisy in fighting against racism abroad while allowing it at home. So the Double V campaign that was initiated by the Pittsburgh Courier in 1942 was joined by African American newspapers around the country. As some historians have called that the beginning of the modern civil rights campaign, and it centered on the analogy between Jim Crow and the Nuremberg laws. Now, for the most part, this analogizing is focused on the Nuremberg laws, as until recently, most have imagined the Italian racial laws as simply to be a weaker echo of the Nuremberg laws, and I think now we know differently. When we think about influence, it's interesting. I think one of the important aspects of Michael's work is to show us that, in fact, the Italian fascist drafters of the laws, and he has reproduced, is one of the most wonderful things about the book, if you see the physical version, is he's reproduced the hand-drawn sketches that the drafters made of all the possible kind of family permutations of the who is a Jew question, of the possible family trees and so forth, and to show how thoroughly they had imagined and thought from scratch about these questions rather than just copying or duplicating other earlier anti-Semitic efforts. So as he says about influence, if there are certainly influences, but they're at a higher level than at the technical level of draftsmanship, of simply copying. A colleague of mine in legal history, the European legal historian James Whitman, has recently been doing very interesting work, research on the influence of Jim Crow laws on the Nazis. And there's quite a bit of evidence, actually, starting with Hitler himself, who is quite a great admirer of starting with the American Immigration Acts of 1921 and 1924, which he writes about in Mein Kampf as the world's only example of race-conscious citizenship law that should be copied. And he was very interested in eugenics, even in prohibition as improving the race, and a number of other Nazis who were involved in drafting the Nuremberg laws. Most interesting, actually, I found Heinrich Krieger, who wrote a 1936 book on U.S. race law, and his hero is Lincoln, Abraham Lincoln, because of Lincoln's interest in expelling the freed slaves, so emancipating the slaves, but eliminating them and sending them to Africa. And of course, at that time, Nazi policy was exactly that with regard to Jews. So the question of influence isn't just about textual borrowing, but in part, could those in Europe point to the United States as fellow travelers and gain some international legitimacy? And I think that was certainly going on. It's also interesting to make the comparison, as contemporaries did, in thinking about the kinds of things that are that are prohibited, or what they really cared about, the forms of discrimination. So clearly in the Nuremberg laws, the German drafters were most focused on sex, racial purity, eliminating that kind of mixing. And as I think Michael shows us, interestingly, the Italian laws, it appeared to me, were as focused on other kinds of exclusion, although there are the marriage provisions, of course, but economic competition, exclusion from public life. And under Jim Crow, we really see both of those, the obsession with racial purity, anti-miscegenation laws, which I think today, looking backward, have seemed to many to be the essence of Jim Crow law. But actually at the time, I think exclusion from public life, disfranchisement, and the violence that went together with that were seen by many in the African American community as even more important in many ways. So another interesting aspect of the work that Michael does is to generalize more broadly about racial law and what it means. And so first about law of race, and then I'll say a couple things about what he has to say about law in general, and really, I would say, the problem of evil law. So he gives us a few ways of thinking about categorizing racial statutes. One is discriminatory schemes versus persecution or genocide. That was a distinction, I guess, Mussolini made. Anti-Semitic versus anti-Black, and here he includes the Italian colonization project in Ethiopia and Libya. And then most interesting, I think, for the questions, for example, of who is a Jew, are the religious or a more racial model. And this aspect of his discussion really resonates for me with some of the comparative work that I've done on the Americas and beyond as well. So one of the things I found in research on trials of racial identity in the United States is that they often turned less on legal definitions of race as percentages of blood and ancestry than on the way people performed their identity. That law all played an important role in tying notions of blood to racial performances, to the way people behaved, to the people with whom they associated, to their practices, and even in the 20th century to what we would think of as more cultural aspects. And as I've studied racial systems, even as far afield as Japan and Southeast Asia, where regimes of caste, for example, are sometimes called invisible race, people marked for an inferior role in society, not by color or phenotype, we see the same kind of marking of racial difference through performance and not just through ancestry. So I'm not surprised to find that even the most racialized models of law inevitably involve culture and religion, that when the law is administered, they tended to look towards Jewish practice as well as ancestry. So, for example, the Italian racial laws, define Jewishness in part based on parentage, but also based on, if one was born to a mixed marriage, on the practice of Judaism or whether one professed Christianity. And Michael notes that in the actual administration or adjudication of these cases, they must use religious and cultural evidence, because even with a racial definition of the Jew, there was simply no reliable definition of that without turning to religious records. And so inevitably, and of course, and this, again, not my area of expertise, but they were coming up against church definitions of identity as well, which were based importantly on practice or what one professed. And so they also had to navigate that. And of course, as David referred to, the category of discriminati, the exemptions that could be given for families holding exceptional titles of merit that essentially allowed the fascists to divide and conquer, to create exceptions for the people who would be most likely to challenge the laws or to ease them into the administration of the law. And this too, allowing certain people to pass is a common feature of even of systems with very sharp line drawing. I'm always trying to convince people that fluidity, that the fact that certain people cross a line doesn't necessarily mean that the line isn't doing a lot of dangerous, work. That it doesn't mean the line doesn't exist just because a few people can get across, or that it doesn't do violence to those on the other side. Another interesting aspect he mentions with regard to these who is a Jew questions are the regulation of mixed marriages, where the Italians showed a great deal of concern for what they thought of as innocent spouses, right? The Aryan spouse of the Jewish man or woman, and the tendency to treat the children of those marriages as Aryans if they were not practicing Judaism, and that actually reminded me of certain places, like in the French colonies under slavery, where mixed marriages could have the possibility of even setting free an enslaved woman and her children, whereas in other contexts, for example, post-Civil War United States, anti-miscegenation laws might punish a white partner very severely, especially white women. The other set of laws that Michael tells us about are really the everyday routine law of race, which are the laws regarding property ownership, business participation, and that's something we really see in race law under slavery, and as well as afterwards, from market competition of slave women to the fear of freedmen gaining too much economic power after Reconstruction, and seems especially important in this context given the stereotypes, of course, the historical stereotypes of Jews. But what really struck me were the analogies of, in the U.S. context, of the Chinese Exclusion Act and the alien land laws in California that were aimed at Japanese landowners. And I'd argue that when we're thinking about racial laws and the analogies, that actually those kinds of laws which limited property ownership and citizenship for Asians, as well as the immigration and naturalization laws, are as important or more important than the better known sort of anti-miscegenation and segregation laws. Well, I just want to end with the really interesting problem that Michael brings up at the end, which is, he says that the adjudication of these laws, and he looks at the judges who are deciding these cases, he says it's this really classic case study of the ethical question of the role of the judge in restraining or restricting unjust legislation. And of course, that problem in the law of slavery is one that has really interested legal scholars and historians for years, but applies in many contexts of how does one administer an evil law, and what's our obligation, what's our moral obligation. So Robert Cover wrote a wonderful book called Justice Accused, where he looks at the judges who made slavery decisions. And we actually have, it's interesting, so Michael sees these judges who just treat this as sort of routine legal matters, and we decide on the basis of the law, we uphold the law. And we certainly see much of that in the slavery context. But we also get these cases where judges will write a big oh, it pains me, the turmoil in my breast as I face this terrible moral dilemma of, what to do in the face of slavery, which is the worst thing a man can do to another man. But it's the law and I have no choice, so I'm going to uphold it. So you get a lot more of these long, elegant prefaces to the same. And the same is true, actually, of the treatment of Indians in the law, the same thing. They often get this is really terrible, what we've done to the Indians, but I'm just a judge and there's nothing I can do about it. And the final question that he asks and answers, I think is a very interesting one for those of us who think about law, is evil law law? Right? And it's certainly one that many scholars of the Holocaust have thought about, right? Do we think of German and fascist law as truly law? And many have answered no. But Michael finds yes, that the divide between law and morality is such that even a truly immoral law can be studied as law. And my study of slavery convinces me that's correct, that it was nothing if not legal, and that race laws were law. And I think that gives us a great deal to think about as well as a society moving forward, because we are capable of creating bad law, even evil law, but we are continuing to create it all the time. So thank you to Michael for giving me the chance to think about this. I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much for inviting me. The legal culture is that when somebody says something, you have to kind of contradict it. You have to say why they're wrong. But they said such nice things that I can't really I can't really do that. So let me just instead take a couple of the themes and see if I can't extend them a little bit that were brought up. I mean, I got into this project in a very roundabout way. It was sort of started on a vacation. Really, I was a tax professor. And I didn't know Italy very well, and I went to Milan, and I took the train to Florence, and I don't know if you know the Florence train station in the summer, but it's overrun with these, like every kind of washed out American or British person who kind of can't figure out what to do with himself goes to Florence in the summer, so you can't get near the train station. So I took my little bit of an Italian, and I rented a car. I didn't realize how obsessed people were with grammar. So I said it was a Korean car. I said, "E un coreano," and the guy said "coreana," because macchina is, it's feminine, so you have to say it's a coreana. It's not a, okay. And I drove, and I decided to go to Ferrara, and I was on the way back. I figured I had the car, I might as well. On the way back to Milan, and I didn't really know Italy very well. I thought, well, it's late at night, it's like 11, they'll probably all be asleep. They were just getting started, 11 o'clock. And the kids, I don't know when the kids sleep in Italy, because it's like the 6-year-old kids are all out, in the piazza at night. And I sort of just took this walk out by I was obsessed. I think I thought that the Finzi Contini's book was really true, like instead of made up, so I was like looking for, Micole's family, even though they don't really exist. But I took a walk out by the cemetery, and I just had this inspiration that this was just such an interesting story to write about from a legal, a perspective. And I think the painful part is that, there's a famous quotation that I think Will Rogers, he was an American humorist, and he said that the problem with most people isn't the things they don't know, it's that most of the things they do know aren't true, you know, and that's really what happened. I mean, I really had this idea, the Italiani Brava Gente, that there was going to be this hierarchy. You know, the Germans were bad, the French were in between, the Italians were good, the Jews were best of all, you know, and none of this works. You know, there were all these terrible Italians. There were even some good, you know, some good Germans. There were Jews who wrote letters to the Segreteria Particolare del Duce, to Mussolini, you know, turning in other Jews, saying, well, how come, you know, my store had to close down and Cohn's store is still open? I mean, that's not fair. He's not following the law, you know. And the other way, you'd get a lot of letters saying, be tougher with the Jews, be nastier with the Jews. But you'd get things like some fellow in Sicily, you know, just in the middle of the war, wrote some letter to Mussolini, said, you know, these race laws aren't right. I mean, we're going to giving up our independence. We're letting the Germans tell us what to do. You know, we're going to pay for this someday, you know. And so the categories, the zona grigia, the gray zone, you know, that Primo, this is what really, that, and I think I really became much less of an essentialist, you know, that there were good people and bad people, and much more of a believer in institutions, you know, that make a difference, and frankly, much less of a kind of American imperialist. When you look at this, you know, the Italians had race laws for 7 years. We had race laws for a couple of 100 years. Some would argue that we still have them effectively. You know, that we don't have a really colorblind society. So another thing when you travel is you get, you know, you get a different perspective on your own country. So those are, you know, big picture things. It's a very humbling experience. It's also, by the way, just in terms of career, I would not recommend a project in comparative law unless you already have tenure and you already have a job. I mean, it eats, I mean, however long you think it's going to take, it takes about an order of magnitude longer. This is particularly true in Italy. I don't know if you've ever worked in Italian archives, but they tend to be open kind of short hours, and like you have to wait for the direttrice to get in. The direttrice is out to lunch, you know, and I actually figured out, in Ferrara is a small place, I actually figured out that there's a thing I mean, some of this is almost comical, but there's a thing in the archives where somebody reports to the fascist authorities that they were walking by a cafe in Ferrara, and they heard these Jewish people speaking, you know, like kind of contemptuously of Mussolini. You know, they were being very haughty. And I just, by the thing, I figured out that it was the same cafe I had gone to at lunch, like that day. I mean, he was talking about what street it was on. I figured the cafe's still there. You know, the place is still there. So there's an awful lot of continuity. As well. There's also a lot of people in Italy, you get to know them, you're talking Italian, and they tell you what a great guy Mussolini was and nobody else did. I mean, that's an experience that you don't get if you only speak in English, but if you start talking, you know, not professors usually, but, you know, waiters, drivers, you get a lot more of that. Same thing with Stalin and Russia. You know, we need another leader like that. I think they may have one now, So those are some general comments, some specific things. I'll just go through them in order. I can't think of a better organizational stream. First of all, I mean, the whole issue with the church, I really kind of sidestepped the issue with the church because there are so many people, you know, like David Kertzer, who've looked at it in so much more detail than I had. I didn't think I could add to it. But the only thing I think you have to understand is that this is part of a broader thing. You know, after the war, this idea that, you know, Catholics and Jews were friends became a big thing. You know, the Fratelli Maggiori, the Jews were the big brothers of the Catholic. That was kind of the John the 23rd line. I mean, you have to realize, I think, when you look at the church, and not just at the church, but at the European middle class, which the upper level of the church came to, the upper classes in Europe, it's a harsh thing to say, but a lot of them wanted the fascists to win, wanted the Germans to win the war. I mean, you know, we tend to see the war as a war for democracy, you know. That's not the way anybody in Europe saw World War II. Most people in Europe saw World War II as a war between communism and fascism. And if you were like not Jewish and you were like a middle class person, or certainly if you were in the church, a lot of people wanted the fascists to win. And I think that's something that Americans have a lot of problem understanding. And I think that when you look at the behavior of the upper level of the church, I mean, there are different levels, but at the upper levels of the church, the so-called black nobility and so on, I don't think they're ever going to release the archives. And I don't think it's because of the Jews. I think it's because if the archives were released, they would show that the church was very, very sympathetic to the fascist cause overall, and they don't want that. So I don't think you're ever going to see, those archives anytime soon. I didn't know how far it had gone back. I think a lot of us, before David's book, I think a lot of us, thought there was a bigger difference between popes than maybe there turned out to be. But I think that's always been there. The post-war issue, the issue of, everybody suffered and therefore, the Jews shouldn't get any special treatment is, it is very deep in all of these countries. But, it's something that happens in a lot of countries. I happen to get interested lately in American Civil War memory, which I think is similar in some respects to European memory of World War II. And, it's very, very interesting, but right after the Civil War in the United States, there was a very strong feeling in this part of the country in the North that the South were traitors, they were rebels. For example, the government paid to bury Union soldiers in the South, and they just left the Confederates on the field. They said, we're not going to bury them. I mean, they were fighting for slavery, they're traitors, it's a rebellion, we're not going to bury them. And it started much later on, in the 1880s and 1890s, this idea of what was called reconciliationism, that everybody was a good guy, and the South was a good guy, and everybody kind of suffered equally, and slavery just sort of happened, and nobody was really at fault for it. So to this day, if you drive to Gettysburg in Pennsylvania, to a Civil War battlefield, you can buy your kid a little Union flag and a Union hat, or you can buy your kid a Confederate flag. Imagine if you could go to Normandy and you could buy your kid a swastika. That wouldn't, nobody would let you do that. But you can go to these battlefields and buy a Confederate flag, which a lot of African Americans feel, from their perspective, is not that different than if you went to Europe and could buy, a German flag or a Rising Sun flag or something like that. So this is something that really happens. There's this very powerful feeling after a war is over that it's over, everybody suffered, we're not, and you don't get any, and it has this very strong, legal, and there was some comical legal things too. I had a chapter in the book about the post-war that the editors told me to take out because they thought it was, I think they said it was there's a word in history, something's ahistorical. It's sort of like a four-letter word, It's sort of like you have to take it out if it's ahistorical. I also had all these comparisons, sort of like what Ariela was talking about with American judges in the Civil War, and they made me take all that out. They said it was anything interesting, is ahistorical because you're always comparing two different periods, which is what people want to do, but it doesn't really work, kind of historically. But what she said, is absolutely true, that there were a lot of these same dilemmas with the American Civil War, and a lot of the same tactics, kind of either avoid it or try to split the difference. But very hard to know what the people were doing. I mean, I came across this case. There's this case, Rosso against Artom. It had to do with dividing, a very technical thing. It had to do with dividing a tenancy in common between a Jew and a non-Jew. There was this lawyer named Perity Grivo, who was this judge, who was a well-known judge, and his son-in-law was Galante Garrone, who was one of the founders of I think, Justitia Libertatis, a very big kind of progressive after the war. And so he wrote this decision kind of with a very narrow interpretation of the race laws, saying the race laws were a derogation from the equal treatment of citizens. It goes back to Roman law, and they had to be interpreted very narrowly. And I thought, oh my God, this is wonderful. I mean, what courage that this guy would do that. But then, when you talk to people in Italy, they said, yeah, but maybe it wasn't really that. Maybe it wasn't real. Maybe it was really more just the independence of the judiciary. There were other cases that came out differently. Very hard to know, if those people were really. I mean, Calamandre, who was a big hero of the post-war period, represented Jews in a couple of cases. But again, very hard to know. Was it really a concern for the Jews? Was it really, an independence of the judiciary? I mean, it is true that fascism was very different from from Nazism or Stalinism. I mean, Stalin didn't lose a lot of cases, I mean, I don't think there were a lot of cases where a judge just said, you're just wrong. I'm sorry, this is a big mistake. I don't think that happened very often. And I think Italy, the word that you hear a lot from historians of this period is a hybrid regime. I mean, that it was a fascist regime, but the church after the Concordat was involved, and there were there were local powers involved. It was never as complete a totalitarian system as the system in Germany or Russia was. And I think that's a big difference. I think that's actually the biggest difference. I don't think the difference is really more and less anti-Semitism. I mean, I think that just varies with the population. I think the difference is the difference in the system. But that issue came up. The comparative issue, moving now to kind of Ariela's comments, I mean, the comparative issue is an interesting thing. I mean, I thought that Italy would be very interesting at the beginning because, it was this racial system on the one hand, but at least until 1943, it wasn't genocidal until the Germans were there. And there's work that Michele Sarfatti has done that says, it could have turned genocidal even without the Germans. I mean, we don't know, what would have happened, that there were plans for the total mobilization of Jewish labor, increase of the work brigades, etc. We don't really have a way to know if that would have happened or not. But I thought it was very interesting, and also because the Italians had colonies in Africa. So I thought it'd be very interesting to look and see if there was a communication between the people running the African department, the colonial office, and the people. By the way, the colonial office is still there in Rome. It's now the ASIO. It's now the Asia thing, and they still have. It's wonderful that you go in there and they still have this big map of Libya from an Italian perspective. I mean, it's still. It's the only room in the world in which the Italian Empire still exists, so I didn't find a lot, and I think because the bureaucrats were jealous of their own territory. First of all, there wasn't much time in Africa. But they only had a few years, and then the British kind of tossed them out of Ethiopia in 1941 or so. So there wasn't a lot of time, and there were a lot of differences on the ground. So I think there was a big, ideological comparison. You look at Difesa della Razza, you look at the magazine. There was a big, they would have these covers where they would show like a Jewish person and a black person coming after like a nice-looking Italian and all that. I didn't find a lot of practical, but there might have been if it had lasted longer. By the way, just parenthetically, again, anybody who thinks that the fascists were sort of softies should take a look at the stuff about Africa. I mean, there was an attempt on an Italian general in East Africa, and they basically announced, I mean, there's no other way to put it, they basically announced a hunting season for Africans. I mean, it was like a reprisal season where any Italian colonist could just start shooting like Africans for a certain period, and then they had trouble getting people to stop. Then you see all these signs saying, okay, the hunting season is over, no more, rappresaglia or something like that. So it was really quite, quite nasty in many ways. So I didn't find, and this is one of the problems, there's not as much comparative work in race, I mean, except for Ariela, there's not as much comparative race as there should be. I think part of it is just the difficulty of, so people get exhausted, you have to know different languages, different legal systems. I think also that people have a lot invested in their tragedy. People don't like the idea that somebody else suffered as much as they do. So if you try to sell to somebody who funds research on anti-Semitism the idea that, what happened to blacks in the South is really a lot like what happened to Jews in Europe, people go, I don't know, but, and the other way around in both directions. So it's partly the technical issue. It's partly, I think, that people get a big investment in their own tragedy and don't, don't like to. So it's a very interesting area. There's not a lot there's not a lot of it. And the other interesting comment I thought she had was this business about the Italian, being more of a religious or cultural model, and the German more of a racial model. And you have to be careful with that because there really isn't a pure racial model. Race doesn't really exist. Like if you took everybody's DNA in the room, you couldn't really tell who was a white or black or Jewish. I mean, they're social categories, they're not really biological. So all this stuff really, I mean, even in Germany, as I understand it, when they had to look to who was like a quarter Jew, eventually they went back to church records. I mean, that was the only way that you could really tell. You know, I mean, you can't really prove. I don't know. Maybe now somebody would come up with some, DNA thing, but you can't really. Nobody. So it's all really cultural on some level, but probably more so in Italy. Sometimes to sort of a comic extent. Like one of the problems they had, they didn't have a Michelin category. They didn't have a hybrid category in Italy. You're either Jewish or not Jewish. So you needed a tiebreaker, and there were quite a few intermarriages. You needed a tiebreaker, but they really had a strong presumption of being Italian. And one of the reasons presumption, they said, come on, they said, what rational person would rather be Jewish than Italian, right? Italian, it's Verdi and it's Galileo and all that. I mean, anybody who wasn't crazy would rather be Italian than be Jewish, right? So we're going to assume, unless they willfully go out and belong to a Jewish community, and do something like that, we're sort of going to assume that they probably meant to be Italian because, that's, which is interesting. I mean, it's kind of, it's subtly an interesting thing because if you have a biological model, if you think that being Jewish is kind of like a disease, which I think a lot of people, in Germany really believed. I mean, you can't be like half diseased. You can't say that like, well, it's a disease, but you're acting well. I mean, you would really, 50% would still probably be kind of pretty dangerous. And so I think that was one difference. But this is true of, this is true of all of these laws. I mean, very few of these laws were really different than things that had been seen before. I mean, I think that this actually goes to Raoul Hilberg's book about Germany. This isn't about Italy, but he has like a side-by-side where he shows that all this stuff, like wearing a Jewish star and going back to a ghetto, and all this stuff, was all stuff that had come from the Middle Ages. And I think you have to realize that, that the idea of equality and all was really pretty recent. I mean, you could conceivably have been in some of these places, they really hadn't taken down, because some of the ghetto walls went back up again after Napoleon. Some of the places they hadn't really come down to like the 1870s or 1880s. So if you have to be a little old, but now that I'm like pushing 60, I don't think that 60 is so old, So that if you were like, 60 or 70 years old in the 1930s, I mean, you could conceivably remember, or at least remember hearing stories about a time when the Jews weren't allowed out of the ghetto, when the Jews, weren't allowed to participate. And I think there's a very powerful sense that society, and you see this in debates about blacks, you see debates about gays today and so on, very powerful sense that society, Christian society, could not survive the introduction of Jews, that it was just, it would destroy the equilibrium of society. One of the interesting things I had, in Italy, in Rome, I usually stay like, I like to stay out of the tourist areas, so I usually stay in like the Aventino, and then you go out to the Archivio dello Stato, which is in, ironically, it's in like a fascist building, basically. It's out in, Ayer. And so you don't go to really the Vatican or that area very much. But I had the occasion, like as a tourist, I walked and I went to the Vatican bookstore, and you look around and they've got books saying like that, I think they had a book called La Dittatura Laica, that like the period before Mussolini was like a dictatorship of the left and the anti-Catholics, and we had to restore, kind of the balance. They were the victims, in other words. They were the victims of this kind of anti-Catholic conspiracy. And I think that was a very powerful view. And I think that's hard for us to accept. I think that one thing that happened after the war is that I think that a number of European countries, I mean, the Netherlands is maybe even a more extreme example, but I think Italy was very, very good after the war at creating a certain image of itself. I mean, like the Dolce Vita image and so on and so forth. There was really a very conscious effort, I think, to market Italy after the war as this place that had just kind of made a mistake and gotten in with Hitler, but nothing really bad had really happened there, and so I think it's very, very hard. And to this day, you've all had this experience. If you get up in front of a more general audience and talk about this is kind of already a sophisticated audience, but people, you got a general audience, particularly a Jewish audience, and people will say, "What are you talking about? I mean, Italy was great. during the war. I have one uncle who, they got out of Poland. I mean, frankly, at the last minute. I think somebody else in my family, probably bribed a customs official or something, and they got out at the last minute. And when you talk to them about it, they say, "Oh yes, I remember we were in Genoa. We took the boat and everybody was eating spaghetti." Well, I don't think anybody ate spaghetti in Genoa in the 1940s. Probably they saw people eating spaghetti in Brooklyn or something like that, and they thought it was Genoa. So it's it's hard for people to accept that there's anything bad that happened. But I think a more balanced perspective is, in the end, is best for everybody. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Please. So, since we're telling stories, I have to just tell a really brief one. I don't have any organic connection to Italy, no Italian heritage, and I didn't learn about the racial laws. It wasn't something that was taught when you studied Italian history. And so I was a really new graduate student, and I was on my first research trip to Rome. And it was summer, and I was in Rome outside with my advisor having dinner, Corso Vittorio Emanuele, and the tables were very close together, as happens. And so my advisor and I were speaking, the woman, and this man was sitting next to us, and he kept offering us, he was by himself, rather distinguished-looking gentleman, and he kept offering to buy us wine and Prosecco, and we thought, who is this person? He was trying to speak to us. So we were speaking about me, deciding on my dissertation topic on fascism. And so he had overheard, and so finally he said, well, maybe I could help. I wrote a little book about fascism, and it was Giorgio Bassani. And and when he said who he was, I became mute. I was terrified. And then of course we did accept many cognacs from him, and that was my introduction to. That was how my interest was piqued to the racial laws, because he spoke about the memory of them, the very selective memory. So I'm going to ask a few questions of you, but just want to say there's so many strengths of this book, and one of them is how it really connects ideology and law, state law, and practice. And it's always difficult for us to avoid a kind of top-down study. We need to have an integrated approach, but it's very difficult to do, of how people reacted to laws, how they reacted to policies, and how they negotiated these things in their everyday. And this book achieves this, and it's throughout, and then there are certain chapters dedicated to this, and that's quite an achievement. It also made me think, it's an obvious thing, but it made me think about, for this subject, how really law sets the tone and the frame for our everyday life. And it shifts the kind of conversation, and it creates climates of what you can do, what you can't do, even on the ground, small interactions. And if you think about how the shift in attitude for same-sex marriage in our country, it's a conversation started and then legislation followed, and it's been a jagged road. But so the book is very strong about how the enforcement of these laws, both in terms of judges and what people did to get around them or with them, really set a certain tone about how to treat the Jews. So it's really valuable that way. So I'll leave the author for last. David, so given what I've said about, there's these cases of pharmacists. The book is very lively, as is the author, you've seen. You have cases of, the pharmacists and hotel owners and people who were everyday people who found these laws had been passed, and what do they do? And so, David, you're an anthropologist by training, and so I'm curious what you thought the book, what kind of light it shed on the operation of daily life under fascism, because you've studied fascism for a long time, but you're also, anthropologist by training. And
well, this.
We have a microphone.
Sorry, is it on? This work? Oh, good. No?
See.
Okay. Yes, there's been, as many here know, kind of upsurge in interest in quotidian history, and including some of the work done, Joshua Arthurs and others working on this, the everyday violence of fascism. And this is important work. And certainly some of the sources that were cited by Michael, especially police sources, are treasure troves of this kind of material, where many of colleagues who work in this kind of thing, where do you get the evidence of what people's actual attitudes are, their everyday experience? For example, the very basic question for us this evening of what was the popular reception to the racial laws? Were people upset? Or were they racing to take advantage of them and turning their neighbors in? Well, luckily, perversely, luckily, this incredible network of secret police and police informants mean that the archives, the state archives, are filled with reports from Turin, from Milan, from Ferrara, and so on, reporting on exactly this. So I think some very interesting work is beginning to come out. It's true that the kind of classic studies of fascism, if you look at De Felice and others, these are terrific works, but they don't pay a whole lot of attention to a more bottom-up perspective. I think in terms of the specifics of the answer on the racial laws, my reading of the evidence is it really depended a lot on parts of the country. But the depressing thing seemed to be that where people could take advantage of them to their own benefit, take away the apartment of a Jewish neighbor, the business of a Jewish neighbor, and so on, people seemed all too quick to do so. And a lot of the people who seemed to be unhappy about it didn't see themselves as having anything to gain. Maybe that's an overly negative, cynical view, but that's, and Michael talks about this in his book, that if the thousands of Jews who were turned in to the Nazis were turned in largely by Italians who got payments, in some cases direct payments, in other cases were paying back various kinds of disputes that they had and so on. So I think we need a lot more research on exactly that kind of level.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And Ariela, so valuable to have you here to bring your combination of your scholarly expertise and your family background. And so you mentioned the culture of adjudication, but I'm wondering what you came away with, what picture of what distinguishes the bureaucratic culture, because this is it's a study of, at so many levels. It's a study of ordinary people reacting to this horrible, legislation that upended their lives. It's also a study of a bureaucratic culture, and a part of the bureaucracy of fascism. It really wasn't studied for very, very recently. So what did you come away with in terms of what distinguished it, what made it perhaps different?
So, is that working? Yes. Oh, okay.
You just have to speak
Hard
close.
to tell. So, actually, David referred to the part of Michael's book that talks about, not only the myth of the good Italian, but the myth of the somewhat bumbling Italian, that the weak is maybe less effectual bureaucracy, less efficiency than the Germans, was part of why people imagine the Italians less serious about the racial laws and less able to enforce them, and then in fact Michael shows in the book that the laws were enforced. They were enforced more severely over time, and that even in the period 38 to 43, that the kind of record keeping and so on that went on is part of what made possible what came after, and so that they can't be kind of exempted from culpability through this kind of their weakness at bureaucracy. I guess what struck me, I guess I thought about it less in terms of the bureaucracy though than the legal, the juridical culture. And here, I'm not an expert on civil law systems in general, and they're so different from common law systems. And one of the things he points out is that in terms of interpretation of the law, they didn't have much leeway, right? And that's a really strong difference from the systems where I study, where one of the interesting features, and you see this in common, studies of South Africa as well, sort of common law systems of racial laws, how often the definitions, the who is a Jew, who is a Negro questions were left to community consensus by law, so that the law itself would say, the judicial decision would be, this is an appropriate question for the community to decide, and so that it would be built in those very kinds of reputation, performance kind of definitions would just be built into leaving it to the community, and where the common law culture allowed for much more divergence often between whatever was happening, whatever opinion is coming down from an appellate judge and what was actually going on the ground. And then in the Italian system, that there wasn't that kind of leeway in the legal system in general. They felt much more bound, and so the interpretations, he argues, vary relatively little. Substantively, what Michael suggests is it's sort of the look and the feel of the law, of the enforcement of the law, rather than the actual substance of what they're enforcing. And I thought that was interesting. I also just wanted to comment on something David said, which is about the neighbors who turn you in and so forth. I mean, one of the things that's was so striking in my own research is that leaving it to the community, right, often meant exactly that. And that what you found was that especially for the people who were on the line, people who were racially ambiguous or lived in communities of racially ambiguous people, their existences depended on these local, and how often what you find in the records are the extraordinary efforts gone to by some neighbor to ferret out the person with black blood and get them, take their, sometimes out of economic competition because I want his store or I want his, but sometimes you would think, what motivated this self-appointed, destroyer of this family's life, and sometimes it's quite chilling.
There's a chapter which is such as the daily plebiscite, how local officials and ordinary Italians responded to the racial laws. And it's very important, this idea of a daily plebiscite, that you're creating a certain climate every single day with your decisions, how to respond to laws that are passed. And I think that one of the huge merits of the book is to give back agency through these local stories to all of the different actors. And I was thinking the way that we, in Italian, when there are books published, the phrase is always, let's say, l'economia sotto il fascismo. It's under fascism. And in a way, I've always thought this, it should be with fascism, during fascism, but this is kind of, the agency is taken away. And this book restores a sense of complexity. It's what Michael was saying. He, if you were ever an essentialist, you stopped being one, after the experience of writing this book. So a few questions for you. One, I'm sorry you had to take out your post-war chapter, so I'm going to ask you a post-war question that goes up to the present in some ways. What do you think about restitution issues? And I was reading just a few months ago, Greece which needs all the funds, I guess, it can have from various sources, has asked Germany in just this February to pay for damages, a new round of payments for damages during the World War II occupation. And there have been, restitution requests. And so what do you think of, do you think that in the case of the case you studied, that this was just swept under the carpet, or it was adequately repaired, and what you think about this?
Well, I want to say, first of all, that I would never have been clever enough to come up with the phrase "the daily plebiscite." I think there's a book, some French intellectual had that or something, so I stole that phrase. But as far as the restitution, yeah, I mean, there's never really been a systematic restitution in Italy or in France. There was a commission called the Anselmi Commission, a few years ago that did a pretty comprehensive, pretty good report. Anselmi was a pretty prominent member of parliament and did a pretty comprehensive report and pretty well showed that the more after 1943, but the spoliation, the kind of confiscation of Jewish assets, and that everybody kind of knew where they went and what banks they went in. So on the technical level, it wouldn't be that hard to do it. I don't think it ever really happened, and I think more immediately after the war, while in principle, I think the Republic was supposed to make restitution. In practice, it was very incomplete. The property would have disappeared. People said they couldn't trace it, and so on. I think maybe even the Jews wanted to get on with their lives and weren't anxious to force the issue. And I think in France and some other countries, you had a similar situation. I think it's the right thing to do. I think that they should do it, even if it was a symbolic amount. I think it would be helpful. That doesn't mean that it's necessarily going to happen, and I think it's partly, in fairness, I think it's two things. Partly it's continuing indifference and anti-Semitism, but partly I think it's the nature of law itself. Law tends to be very, very good at dealing with small issues. If you hit somebody's car, and you total their car, and they can figure out exactly what it's worth and they'll make you pay. On the other hand, if you have a thing like slavery in the United States, the system isn't really very good at dealing with that. It's very hard. You have issues like sovereign immunity. You have technical issues like computation. You have political resistance to it, and legal systems. There's this odd dynamic where if the thing is very limited at a very specific amount of people, like I think the Japanese Americans, which was a terrible thing, but was a relatively defined group of people, and it was over. They were able to make the restitution, and you have this perverse thing where the bigger it is and the more it's continuing, the harder it is to make the restitution. So I think the right thing to do would be to make at least some symbolic payment, to the heirs of the Jewish community. But it doesn't seem to be happening, and I'm not even sure that it's as big a priority. I think the Jewish community right now is probably more concerned with the resurgence of anti-Semitism currently than they are, with this issue. So.
Okay. So I think we can open up to some questions from the audience. Yes, sir.
I would like to know, do we know or do you know anything about the period that Mussolini went to power in 1922? What happened or what was happening until 1938?
You mean in terms of racial laws?
The Jewish population, yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, it's synoptic. It's a big question, so we'll have a small answer. David.
Yes, that's actually a big question, the history of the relation of the fascist state with the Jews from 22 to 38. And there's a whole debate about Mussolini razzista. Was Mussolini anti-Semitic from the beginning, and was fascism anti-Semitic? As was mentioned, as I mentioned, the fact that his mistress in 1922 was Venetian Jew is one of the bits of evidence that's sometimes used to show that, well, neither Mussolini nor the fascist regime was basically anti-Semitic in the early days. I would say that Mussolini and general Italian society was anti-Semitic, but so was American society at that time. If you look at, Even when I was growing up in Westchester, the country clubs and so forth, there were no Jews in the yacht clubs. So that's, so when said, the question is, was there anti-Semitism? Yes, but my own reading is, in general, certainly Mussolini was not any more anti-Semitic than the general kind of Italian in the street, and it wasn't a major issue for him. There were those certainly in the church who were eager to get the fascist regime to move against the Jews, and I talk about that in my recent book. But until the mid-30s or so, this doesn't really happen. And of course, there were Jewish fascists. Those of you who, for example, read Sandro Stile's book, Benevolence and Betrayal, the first chapter is about a Torinese Jewish fascist family. And so, just at a very general level, the move against the Jews on behalf of the fascist regime, there were people like Farinacci, there were those who were trying to push the fascist regime into an anti-Semitic direction, but until the mid-30s, I don't think there was much sign of that.
Would you like to add something?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's basically right. I mean, there have been people who go back. There was a fellow wrote a book a few years ago claiming that Mussolini was always anti-Semitic, and there were these quotations, around the dinner table that the Jews were pigs and he was going to settle accounts. But then on the next page he says that the French were pigs and he was going to settle accounts with them too. I mean, it's hard to know. I mean, it kind of ties into the question of whether there was really a consistent fascist ideology at all, or whether it was sort of changed. There's also a big question about what changed in the middle 1930s, because there was this propaganda campaign that preceded the laws for a couple of years, and kind of firing of Jews from positions and so on. And that's another interesting question. I mean, it wasn't just Germany. I mean, there's some combination of Germany, possibly the Spanish Civil War, possibly the experience in Ethiopia that conditioned the people to be somewhat more racist. So that's the second question. What caused it to cease being latent and come out into the but again, if you look at Italian history overall, I mean, there's a tendency. I mean, I don't want to be cynical, but there is this tendency to kind of want to be on the winning side, So I mean, you have this latent anti-Semitism in the late 30s when that seems to be the way things are going. That becomes dominant. After the war, suddenly the two biggest parties are the Communist Party, which kind of identifies with the Soviet Union, and the Christian Democrats would kind of identify with the U.S. So asking the whole question, is this stuff authentically Italian, or is it an external import? There's always some element of both. I mean, you have these internal things, and which one becomes stronger, I think depends on the international situation a little bit.
Yes.
How were the racial laws enforced against Jewish judges and Jewish lawyers?
Judges and lawyers, yeah. How was the racial laws enforced against Jewish judges and Jewish lawyers?
Well, I mean, I think, I mean, the lawyers, I think that Dave discussed this a little bit. I mean, the judges would have lost their jobs. I don't know how many there were. And the lawyers and doctors would have been allowed to work only for Jewish clients unless they got a special exception. But there were, there were efforts to fight back against things like that. There was a group of doctors in Rome who kind of figured out, with cooperation from non-Jews, kind of ways to beat the laws. There were some lawyers. There was a whole business in kind of in backdating documents, because there was certain transfers couldn't be made after the effective date of the racial laws, and people would go back and they would date them earlier. So I mean, there were always people. I mean, generally speaking, in any system like this, if you're educated and well off, you're better able to beat the laws, than if you're poor. And I think that some of the perception that you see in movies and so on, that kind of a clever person could get around the laws, probably results from the fact that that books or memoirs tend to be written by people in the upper class. For example, most of the books and memoirs came out of the North, where the Jews tend to be a little better off. Very few of them came out of Rome, which is a big community and wasn't quite as wealthy. So, you know, it's possible that some of the people in the professions found ways to survive, but you also have this whole thing of what they call commercio ambulante, I mean, basically street peddlers, who, you know, first they took away their license to have carts, then they took away their license, you know, to have whatever, you know, vehicles, and they basically were made destitute. I mean, they didn't have any, you know. So it was pretty cruel, you know, for the average person. And then just another interesting thing about the street peddlers is there was never really a law. It wasn't in the law. It was kind of a police regulation. They just said, well, the spirit of the law requires us to do this. So that once you have a bureaucracy, there's a tendency, you know, to kind of expand it, you know, and so the persecution tended to get worse. The other thing that happened, I think, is that people kind of figured out that the war wasn't going that well for Italy, and they needed somebody to blame. And I think as the war went on, it started to get worse. So, you know, as a general rule, there's fewer exceptions, and there's less evasion as the war goes on.
Stefano.
Yeah, I have a question for all three of you, because you all touched on this issue of the relationship between the church and the racial laws. And I remember one of the quotations was, the whole issue begins with the Lateran Pact. And as a matter of fact, with the Centro Primo Levi, we devoted 2 days of studies last year to the study of the Lateran Pact. But as a matter of fact, Pius XI, as David knows very well, denounced a vulnus, and I think it was the only international entity that denounced the racial laws against directly Mussolini, who didn't reply to the letter. Pius XI died shortly after, so that denunciation of a vulnus, I mean, of a very strong, how you say, colpo,
Blow. Like a blow.
damage to the concordat fell into nothing. Of course, the only issue that the Pope raised against the racial laws was marriage law, on which the Holy See kept complete monopoly with the Lateran Pacts. And I was wondering whether in the research of Professor Livingston, vis-a-vis what you said about the judges normally always ruling pro the racial laws, unless they came in contrast with preceding laws regarding, and the example of the pension law was very clear that you made. I was wondering whether they were called to judge in terms of marriage issues, marriage situations. They would rule in the same ways or in different ways, and whether the protest of the Vatican that went unheard officially, at least in the channels that are known to us, had any effect in the application from the judiciary.
I think it's actually a very interesting question. I haven't seen any work on that. I don't know whether Michael has seen anything on that, because as you mentioned, the racial laws get a very strong reaction from the Pope, who writes to the king. It's the only time he writes to the king to complain about what Mussolini is doing. And the king, as usual, is, you know, pathetic. But but as you mentioned, the only thing he doesn't complain about what happens to the Jews. He complains that Catholics are being affected by the anti-Semitic laws. That's what he complains about. That converted Jews and children of them in some cases are, according to the racial law, not being allowed to marry Catholics. And the Pope is angry for 2 reasons. One, not directly relevant to us, namely doctrinally. Of course, this goes against the doctrine of the Church that a sincerely converted, baptized Jew should be considered a Catholic and not a Jew. But just as importantly was, as you mentioned, this is where the vulnus comes in, that it goes directly against the Concordat, since the Concordat had, for the first time since the Kingdom of Italy was formed in 1861, gave to the Church the ability to have their marriages recognized automatically by the state. And so what would be interesting to me would be, did any of these cases actually come to the judiciary? Because it would seem to be a conflict in law, and I'm not aware of anything that's been written about this.
So we can, if you, the question was for all of you, so.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there were a lot of cases. I think I had a couple of divorce cases in there in the middle that had some of that issue, although there were a lot of issues. There was the church, what if it was a foreign marriage? Most of it was resolved administratively. But and they did not, give the church a lot of what they wanted in terms of, so there was a lot of upset there. I think that may, explain some of the curious, it seems bizarre for the church to say that we were, against the racial laws, when it seems plainly that they weren't. But of course, from their perspective, from the church's perspective, the Jews who converted to Catholicism are more important than the ones who didn't, right? I mean, the ones who didn't are probably, kind of finished, in trouble anyway, according to the doctrine at that time. And so I think one of the reasons that you have this odd situation of the church saying, what are you talking about? We did all this to help the Jews, is they're thinking of the Jews who were, who had converted to Catholicism, which in some cases they did try to help, So I think there's a real, difference. I think, by the way, just today, I think there are some people in Italy who would tell you today that that the Jews still haven't really regained a totally equal status. I mean, I'm not an expert on Italian law today, but my understanding is that, there's still religious instruction in Italian schools. You can sort of get up and opt out if you want to, but it's still there. And my further understanding is that the church marriages are automatically recognized, and I think if there's a Jewish marriage, somebody's actually got to go and walk it over, unless they changed that very recently. So I think there are people who will tell you that they've never completely regained the total equality, civic equality.
Ariela, do you want to speak? So we have time for one more question. So.
I was going to ask how it affected actually the Jews and the practice of Judaism and the printing of the Hebrew books, of the education of their children. Did they go far enough to, I know, there were ghettos and so on, as in Venice and so on. Was that affected any?
That's an interesting question, and I it's hard to measure because you don't know what would have happened, but I think it did have one very ironic effect, which was that, all these, very few Jews went to private schools, to Jewish schools before this happened. They all went to public schools. All of a sudden, they're thrown out of the public schools, and then you've got, and they had, people like Bassani are teaching, I think he was teaching like high school, or junior high school. So you probably actually got an increase in Jewish religious consciousness of what was there before, and to ways that last till today. If you go to the Cidec in Milan, which is the Jewish Documentation Center, it's in this little building over the railroad tracks on the way the commuter trains out of Milan. And this is basically the building where the Jewish school was in the 1930s during the race laws. I mean, there's still a little synagogue there. And in every city, everybody knows where it was. They say, oh yeah, that's where the school was. I mean, there's a sign in Ferrara and something. So it's hard to know, it probably had the odd effect of making people actually more conscious of being Jewish. It depends on your perspective. I know people, they have more faith than I do, who will say, well, this was the plan. The Jews were getting away from God, and this was to kind of show. I mean, I don't have enough, a level of faith, to accept that. No, at some point, in the German, when you got to occupation, the synagogues were closed down. But they never really, I think, partly because of the public opinion, they never really destroyed the synagogues. There was an attack on the synagogue in Ferrara. There was apparently a plan to turn the synagogue in Trieste into a swimming pool. This is a very large thing, and there was apparently a plan, but it never happened. The synagogue in Turin was hit by an American bomb. It wasn't. But this is a bigger question in Italy. This goes to the fascists. They wanted to get rid of the Jewish people. It wasn't like that they were trying to convert them. They wanted. So you have, like in Poland, you have places where I was in Krakow where every single Jew was killed and the synagogue's still there. It's odd. You have these synagogues without. So it was a different kind of persecution. It wasn't a let's convert them persecution. It was a.
Well, join me in thanking our panel and our author. Wonderful evening.